Our first reading today is from Isaiah chapter 52, verses 7 through 10. Isaiah proclaims news of great joy. Your God reigns. Just as God saved the people from oppression in Egypt, God delivers Israel from exile. All the earth will witness the saving acts of God. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good joy, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Listen, your sentinels lift up their voices. Together they sing for joy. For in plain sight they see the return of the Lord to Zion. Break forth together into singing, you ruins of Jerusalem. For the Lord has comforted his people. He has redeemed Jerusalem. The Lord has bared his holy arm before the eyes of all the nations, and all the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of God. Our psalm today is Psalm number 98. Please read responsively. Sing a new song to the Lord, who has done marvelous things, whose right hand and holy arm have won the victory. O Lord, you have made known your victory. You have revealed your righteousness in the sight of the nations. You remember your steadfast love and faithfulness to the house of Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the victory of our God. Shout with joy to the Lord, all you lands. Lift up your voices, rejoice and sing. Sing to the Lord with the harp and the voice of song, with trumpets and the sound of the horn. Shout with joy before the King. Let the sea roar and all that fills it, the world and those who dwell therein. Let the rivers clap their hands, and let the hills ring out with joy before the Lord, who comes to judge the earth. The Lord will judge the world with righteousness, and the peoples with equity. Our second reading today is from Hebrew, chapter 1, verses 1 through 12. This letter opens with a lofty declaration of Jesus' preeminent status as the Son, through whom God created the world and through whom our sins are cleansed. God speaks to us now through the Son, who is exalted even above the angels. Long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. He is the reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he has made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is far more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, you are my son, today I have begotten you? Or again, I will be his father and he will be my son. And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. Of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his servants flames of fire. But of the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And in the beginning, Lord, you founded the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like clothing. Like a cloak, you will roll them up, and like clothing, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will never end. Here ends our second reading.
Our gospel this morning is John chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. Glory to you, O Lord. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. You may be seated. Good morning. And again, Merry Christmas. But I have bad news. Terrible news. The implications of the 10th verse of this passage are bad news. Bad news on Christmas morning. That's no good. No one wants to hear that. But when you look at this, he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. I am a little afraid. Think about what that means. That means, though God created the world, the Word, Jesus, created the world and even was in the world wasn't able to recognize him. Now here's where it gets tricky for us. We, as far as I can tell, are part of the world. If anyone thinks any differently, maybe we should talk later. But we are all part of the world. We are in the world. So when we hear that the world, despite being created by God, and despite God being in the world, didn't recognize God there, we must wonder, do we recognize God? Now, I'm not saying we don't know God. Maybe we do to different extents, maybe we don't. But what I am saying is that if the world has the capacity to forget and fail to recognize God when God appears, that means we, who are also part of the world, also have the capacity to forget and not recognize God. I must confess, there have been times in my life when my grandparents did not recognize me. They forgot who I was. I had grown a bit of a goatee, and had grown my hair out longer than when I was in high school. And my mom's dad, I went to the door and knocked, and he didn't know it took him a minute to figure out I was Gary. But I have never in my adult life failed to recognize my parents or grandparents. It's a little different going that way. We recognize our source. We know where we came from. My dad hasn't changed at all since I met him. But my mom has gone through different hairstyles. I have never once not known she was my mom. And yet, the world, and us included, have the capacity to forget God and fail to recognize God when God appears. What could this possibly mean? How could this work? I have an example that might go a little off the beaten path, but bear with me. I think we could all probably say that to some extent, our class, our graduating class, is a source, maybe not the only source, but a source of our identity. For me, growing up in UTAN, I was with the same people for 13 years. From kindergarten through my senior year, it was more or less the same set of people. The makeup changed a little bit. Some people left, some new people came in, but more or less it was the same people. These people I saw for the majority of the year, every year, for 13 years. They were an important part of who I was. And even if you are someone who didn't really participate much with your high school class, as I did not participate very much with my high school class, they're still important in shaping your identity. For me, the fact that I didn't get along well with a lot of people in my class was part of why I was kind of a shy, introverted, socially awkward nerd. That's who I was because I wasn't with them. And the people I did hang out with in my class were also kind of shy and quiet and introverted, more or less. Even though I didn't hang out with them a lot, they shaped my identity. They were a source of my identity. And I was with them all the time. And yet, sometimes they surprised me. My senior year, again, this is after I'd been with these people for 12 years. One day I came into school, it was a Monday morning, and things were a little bit different. Everyone was talking about some strange event that I had no idea had taken place. Apparently, sometime over the weekend, a bunch of the senior class had gotten together and taken a few cases of beers and hung out in some field somewhere and had a little bit of a party. I didn't know about this until Monday morning, and it was very clear that at least some of the people wanted everyone to know that they had done this, because they talked about it nonstop. They talked about it, some of the girls in my class talked about it so much so that the Spanish teacher stopped teaching and just joined in and talked about it with us. And what was even more bizarre at this time was the girls in my class were asking the Spanish teacher questions about what she thought about our class's participation in some of these taboo things. And they asked her specifically, how many of us do you think have been drunk? How many of us do you think have done some sort of drug? How many of us do you think have done something else? And I, being the sheltered, introverted nerd that I was flabbergasted when she gave percentages that were other than 0 or like 3. I had no idea my class was doing this. Perhaps part of the reason I didn't get invited to parties. And the reason for that is I didn't want to go to parties. I wasn't interested. And that is my point. See, I, by being someone who's introverted and shy, just kind of assumed everyone was that way. So it was startling to imagine that my other classmates were normal. Now, I'm not telling this story because I want to shame my classmates or tell on them. Frankly, I don't think it's a terrible moral failing of them to have a party in a field with each other. It may have been irresponsible, but it's not evil. The point in sharing this story is the surprise. Despite the fact that I was with them and they were a source of my identity, I had no idea that this was going on. I was flabbergasted to learn this. I did not recognize my class, even though I was with them. And the reason for that is because I assumed everyone was more like me than I should have. Psychologists call this projection, where we assume what's happening inside our heads is also happening inside the heads of everyone around us. So if we're feeling particularly down on ourselves and practicing self-loathing, and we say, I hate myself, we might assume that everyone else also hates us and be wrong. On the other side of things, if we're really high on the horse, top dog, the fat cat, any other animal analogy you want to throw in here, and we start thinking, I'm the best, and we assume everyone else also knows we're the best, because why wouldn't they? That's also projection. And sometimes projection comes across in this interesting way, which is the old saying, the pot calling the kettle black. It's like that, but worse, because what we do is we take the things we loathe about ourselves and we assume that must be true of other people. And where this particularly becomes a problem is when somebody makes a decision that we wouldn't have made ourselves. We assume that they made the decision having the same values and beliefs and wants and needs as we have. And then we think to ourselves, if I were to make this decision, I would be making it for some terrible reasons. So they must also be making it for some terrible reasons. Now, it could be true that when my classmates had this party in this field, that they did it because they wanted to get drunk and go wild. They wanted to stick it to the man, rebel against their parents. They wanted to be a little criminal just for the thrill of it. But more than likely, they just wanted to socialize. It's not that big of a deal. But if I would have projected and assumed that if I were there, this is what I would have been doing it, this is why I would have been there, and projected that onto them, they would have been a lot more evil in my eyes. So could that be it? Does the world not recognize God because the world projects itself onto God? Well, yes. When we want to justify a war, we portray God as a soldier. We play up all the biblical imagery of God defending Israel with might and valor, and we say we can go to war because God is a warrior. And when we want to celebrate wealth and prosperity, we portray God sitting on a golden throne with a golden crown surrounded by gold and jewels. If you don't believe me, this is actually a historical thing that happened. When the early church transitioned from being persecuted by the Roman Empire to being the Roman Empire, there was a lot less images made of Jesus hanging on the cross and a lot more images made of Jesus looking like an emperor. Because when people in power worship God, they want God to look like them, not like the people they hurt. We have a habit of projecting ourselves onto God, and then we forget who God really is. Another problem is as we're projecting ourselves onto God, sometimes we take a look at the world and all of the things we see in it, and we see, because we see this, it must be normal. This must be right. This is just the way it is. And sometimes that works, but sometimes it hurts. Because when we see people pushed to the margins of society, getting crushed by oppressive systems, we might look and say, oh, well, there's always losers. Someone always gets hurt. We can't really have a system in which everyone can be happy. I wouldn't want to be them, but someone's got to be on the bottom. We accept it as normal. This is just the way it is. There's no other way to do things. So maybe it's not bad news that the world doesn't recognize God. Maybe there's good news in this. Because if the world doesn't recognize God, that must mean God's way of doing things is different than the world's way of doing things. This is a reminder that when we project onto God and see God as some rich Lord holding it over all the poor people, we're wrong. That's incorrect. That's not who God is. When we look at a world and see people suffering and say, sorry, but we can't do any better than this. Someone always has to suffer. This is normal. We can look at this and say, no, that's wrong. That's not God's way of doing things. When we look everywhere around the manger on Christmas Eve, we see a world of scarcity, of a lack of hospitality. No room in the inn. People grabbing for scraps. Anxiety and fear. We see an evil king so bent out of shape by his own paranoia that he's hunting down this baby to kill it. We see a world somewhat reflected in our own. We see pain and fear and paranoia. People making bad decisions that hurt other people because they've been hurt. People making bad decisions that hurt other people because they're afraid there won't be enough to go around. But when we look in the manger, we see the God that the world does not recognize. God completely different from the way the world does things. We see a God vulnerable, a baby in a manger. We see a God who is enough for the world when the world is built on believing there's not enough to go around. When we look into the manger, we get a chance to see who God really is and recognizing God, not as the world projects onto God, but as God comes to reveal God's self to us. There is another way. The evil and darkness and pain and fear we see around us will not last forever. That will be shaken. And all that remains will be the eternal, enduring love of God. Amen.